Okay, I'm Luke Turnock, as it says. Subject today is going to be embodying identity, body capital amongst, should say male, gym-going subcultures. I'm specifically going to be exploring masculinities. That's to do with my sample selection, and I'll get into methods, but very largely male samples, so I'm framing everything within a framework of masculinities. And I'm essentially going to split it into two parts. I'm going to explore subcultural identities and identity formation in relation to masculine archetypes, and then I'm going to explore how social media is influencing this sort of embodying of these different archetypes. So, just a bit of background. My research primarily was based on steroid-using subcultures, so that's part of the reason for having a particularly male focus, although some female gym goers do use steroids as well. But in recent years, there's been a very large increase in the use of these performance and image-enhancing drugs, primarily steroids, but also fat burners have become very popular. And it seems that this activity is becoming quite normalized. So I've explored it through sort of Parker, Measham, and Aldridge's framework for drug normalization, but there's been more quantitative studies, such as Bates and McVeigh's. And what's happened is use has quadrupled amongst 16 to 24-year-old males between the years 2015 and 2017. So clearly this is a very rapidly growing phenomenon, and part of what me and these other researchers are trying to do is unpack what the motivations are, why use has suddenly seems to have exploded. And as we will see, part of this seems to be driven by social media and this increasingly prevalent online workout culture, as we could term it. But from the perspective of today's presentation, I want to unpack the fact that this phenomena it's necessarily linked to understanding of body capital within these gym-going subcultures, and that in and of itself is of course linked to understanding masculinities within gym-going subcultures and the different masculine archetypes that these varying subcultures seek to embody. So just a quick note on the methodology. It was an ethnography where I was visiting gym environments, researcher submersion, talking to people whilst we were in gyms, doing some semi-structured qualitative interviewing, and basically merging things together and following sort of Glaser and Strauss's method of comparative analysis and the development of a grounded theory. So rather than having a strict hypothesis, I drew from the data what you're going to see today. So before I start exploring masculinities in the gym, I just wanted to help you visualize the gym, because I'll use this term, but actually there's a variety of gym environments and they reflect the subcultural standards of the groups that participate in the activities in these different gyms. So as we can see, a powerlifting gym, very sort of, I suppose you could say rugged. It's raw. They've got these squat racks. There's not really much of anything else. And you compare it to the commercial gym on the other side, where it's a lot more polished. We've got signs up telling people how to correctly behave. You need to put all the weights away. You can see they're very different spaces. The powerlifting gym, everything's crammed in so they can get as much equipment in as they can. The commercial gym, you can see on the very left-hand edge, there's a sort of social space for people to socialize and interact. And as we'll see, this reflects the masculine archetypes of the groups that visit these different gyms. But just as refers to identity formation, I've got this quote at the bottom, which I think is quite a good one. This comes from a member of what's termed lad culture, or this sort of hedonic workout culture, which I'll get into. But he notes that time in the gym is you're spending it with your mates. You've got your mates, you're hanging out with them. It's free time, that's your downtime, that's what you do to relax. So clearly we can compare this to other subcultures of young and particularly working class male identity formation. If you think of rave movements or other subcultures of drug use, which have been explored in previous research, very much we'll see it ties in the same kind of identity formation that we've seen elsewhere. So in as far as embodiment and masculine archetypes go, obviously Klein and others have written about how industrialization has separated men from perhaps a functional need for muscle. No longer are men required to work in mines, for example. So really there's been almost Klein calls it crisis, masculinity in crisis, wherein young men find themselves seeking to feel masculine in some way, and visiting the gym allows them to embody a kind of masculine, or a form of masculinity, a masculine identity. And as I've noted, Giddens obviously explores the reflexive body capital in the reflexive body, which is a means by which identity formation can occur for these young men when they join a masculine subculture. By pursuing a certain archetype or a certain image, they can also form identity. So, as I've noted, therefore, identity is linked to the pursuit of a range of different masculine archetypes, and I'll explore those shortly. And of course, the body is one element of this, but we'll get into, I mentioned gym spaces very much reflect the subcultural ideals or masculine ideals of these subcultures, and clothing, etc. And I've just noted, counter to that, Monahan points out there are still some roles that exist where men do have a functional need for physical strength, such as doormen. So perhaps they don't fit perfectly in this spectrum, which I'm going to present here. But by and large, this seems to hold up primarily, as I said, focusing on men, focusing on young men in gym-going subcultures. We can see, I've detailed here a spectrum of masculinities, almost, wherein powerlifters at the near end of this spectrum have the most orthodox conception of masculinity, what it means to be masculine. And as we move further along this spectrum, we move more into what could be termed an emergent hedonic masculinity, which is a lot more focused on sexual dominance and physical appearance, and showing off one's physical appearance. And that's really what I'm going to get into. And of course, as I've noted, drug use plays a very large part in how these bodies are formed, which fit these different masculine archetypes, but I'll explore more beyond the drugs. So exploring the archetype of the powerlifter as a form of identity, I've noted that respondents in my research, they frequently, the ones who are powerlifters, actually identified as being a powerlifter before ever competing in a powerlifting meet tournament. And how this happens is by being submerged in these subcultural environments with the norms of the powerlifter. They're encouraged to enact certain behaviors and certain image choices, clothing, which make them into the powerlifter before ever being involved in competitive powerlifting. And Sam Fussel's done some very similar work on how bodybuilders essentially embody the ideal of the bodybuilder before ever competing in tournaments. And one of the key things to do with powerlifters is that they seek to appear informed, especially regarding drug use, but in terms of training more broadly, training methods, nutrition. A large part of the culture is this desire to read up so that one is informed, and new entrants into the subculture are strongly disciplined to conform with this standard. So those who might be inclined towards abuse of the steroids, they're strongly criticized by more established members of the subculture. And this sort of serves as an enforcement mechanism, a cultural transmission, I suppose, which helps to prop up this orthodox idea of masculinity, whereby for powerlifters, it's considered that an obsession with image, which is considered very masculine by those in the hedonic subcultures, that's considered feminine, which is what we would see under sort of classic conceptions of masculinity. So big muscles to powerlifters are considered masculine, but they're only considered masculine if they are for strength, for function. And so we don't really see a massive concern with body fat, which we do for other gym-going subcultures. A lot of the other gym-going subcultures will use special fat-stripping drugs. Don't see those so commonly with powerlifters because being fat doesn't particularly harm them as far as they're concerned image-wise, because you can be fat and strong and still embody that masculine archetype. Whereas, as we'll see for the sort of lag culture, workout culture, having a low body fat and being ripped and able to show off six-pack, that would be considered more masculine. So there's quite a divergence in the bodies that these groups seek to attain. And as I've noted at the bottom there, clothing and language choices also reflect this ideal. So this image of a powerlifter, as you can see, he's got a full t-shirt with sleeves on, and we'll compare that in the next slides to what we'll see for lag culture, where it's these really thin string vests that show off a lot of the musculature. So very, very different clothing choices. And also I've noted there are things such as if someone is in a powerlifting gym and they go to wear gloves, they'll be mocked. That's delicate. You're worried you're going to hurt your hands. So again, this idea that these behaviors are feminine, therefore we will criticize those who follow these behaviors in order to encourage them to conform with the subcultural ideal. And the same with string vests and leggings. So lag culture. I think this particularly image-focused manifestation of lag culture is a quite working class one, but it seems to be similar to the sort of culture that we see at universities with a lot of binge drinking and initiations. There might be some overlap there. But as far as gym cultures go, I'll treat this one as distinct. But we can see right away, you can see from the images, very different to the imagery that we saw for the powerlifters. And I've included quotes to show that a lot of the motivations, they're not so much based on this orthodox conception of masculinity, whereby a man needs to be strong and a man needs to be informed and able to sort of take charge in his subculture. In lag culture, it's more a man needs to be able to pick up and sexually dominate women. A man needs to be able to engage in violence if called upon, which is implicit in powerlifting subculture in terms of the strength, but here it's a lot more explicit, as we can see from that quote there. It's all about who can be the biggest alpha male. Should two alpha males clash, you can handle it, you can have a fight. That's not really language we see from powerlifters, even if one could imply that strength training is geared towards a sort of martial ideal. And as I said with sex, we've got this quote, summer in Ibiza's coming in, that's the goal really. And we'll see a lot of it is focused on summer in Ibiza or nights out or sessions, these different terms that are used, which all mean the same thing, a lot of drinking, a lot of partying, and trying to engage in a lot of sex. So very different from powerlifters, and as I've noted here, the masculinity or the idea of masculinity is that it should be showy. If big muscles are masculine, which help with the aforementioned goals, ideals of the subculture, then the logic seems to be showing off a physique that is very muscular, must therefore be a masculine trait. So I've tied this in with ideas of dominance. Perhaps it's a form of peacocking almost. It's showing off, here's my physique, I'm very masculine, and trying to be intimidatory in some way. But as we can see, a lot of string vests, gym selfies, lifting up shirts to take pictures of abs in the gym in front of everyone, and training and drug use very much based on this idea. Big arms, ripped six-pack. Very, very distinct. So before I get into social media, which I'll touch on next, I just wanted to point out how this idea of using group conceptions of masculinity actually will be very helpful to policy, because if we can identify the behaviors of these groups on a spectrum of the type of masculinity they seek to embody, we can actually target those most likely to be using drugs in a very risky manner, which are those with the more hedonic ideal of masculinity. Because they're much more focused on training for the weekend, training for summer, they have a much shorter temporal horizon, so they're more likely to use drugs in a very risky manner. So by understanding drug use within a framework of masculinity, we can actually more effectively come up with policies that target these groups. So as I've noted, if we can understand this idea of the spectrum of masculinities between the orthodox powerlifters and their hedonic lag culture with other groups coming in between, you can just visually take a look at a group such as that. That's me with a group of casual weight trainers who sort of fall in the midpoint of this spectrum, where we can see some of the overlap with the two different groups. Everyone's wearing a full t-shirt, nobody's quite engaging in the really show-off hedonic fashion, but there's clearly an element of being fueled by homosocial bonding here. There's some degree of wanting to show off physique. So because we're able to, with an understanding of the spectrum, place groups on it, we can target them much more effectively for harm reduction. So, as promised, social media. As Giddens says, in late modernity, the globalizing tendencies of modern institutions are accompanied by a transformation of the day-to-day social life, and this, of course, includes the body, which is reflexively made. So as social media has accelerated globalization, and we're now in contact with people on the other side of the world at the click of a button, we can anticipate that the way in which our body is seen and how our body is reflexively made has similarly been affected by this. So even if identity is tied to an embodied habitus, as Schilling and Meller suggest, social media allows for a globalized habitus. So instead of the powerlifting gym and comparisons with those in the gym, now we have powerlifting YouTube, powerlifting Instagram. We're looking at powerlifters from across the world. Similarly, the commercial gym is no longer me and other men from my local town. Now it's an online workout culture where I'm exposed to images of men from all over the world who are engaged in this form of training. And that really does seem to exacerbate the effect of these masculine archetypes and the way in which young men are striving to attain them. And identity is now linked to one's body capital with reference to this globalized ideal as opposed to a more local one. Although, of course, media historically, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger on the television, obviously there has been some element of global ideals prior to this, but I would imagine social media has greatly exacerbated this, as we see from the bottom. There's been a few researchers, Bleeker, Mulrooney, and Van der Ven, exploring this idea of the steroid selfie. So I've decided to fit this in with my data that I've managed to gather from the ethnography, and if we can see, there's an example of this online workout culture. Jeff Said, who's got 3.5 million followers worldwide. You can see that physique, even though he writes natural aesthetics, I would be quite skeptical of that. You can see I've got a few quotes of young men talking about the impact of social media, that it's had either on them personally or on their friends. So I'll just read these out. With this new age fitness sort of trend going on, everyone wants that quick path, don't they? Things do trend a lot more now because of social media. So very aware that social media is shortening temporal horizons. There's increasing urgency to look like Jeff Said. My friends do anything to get likes, anything to get people to comment. It's purely for likes. And you can imagine the more of sort of a freak one looks like, the more attention it's going to draw, so the more likes, the more comments. And there's been other researchers talking about the harms of social media in this regard, even not talking about the body, just this desire for instant gratification. And as you can see, one directly says, I think social media is a lot to blame for steroid use. And finally, this bottom quote, fitness models, people like Jeff Said, you see them, you want to be like him. And of course, there's only one way a normal guy's going to wind up looking like that. So here's a picture of me. I just wanted to use this. I'm aware some people in the audience have actually talked about belonging in a martial arts organization and identity through martial arts. But for me, this only occurred to me after the fact that I had set my cover photo to me doing jiu-jitsu only about 6 months into beginning training jiu-jitsu. And I just realized you can clearly see I'm very clearly trying to identify myself as a fighter, trying to embody that fighter archetype. And because I could see it myself, I thought, wow, this clearly shows just how significant social media is in identity formation for people. And of course, as I've noted there, if images of drug-enhanced bodies are a subcultural ideal, counter to the jiu-jitsu ideal, the desire to have such images of oneself will increase. So my final slide, drugs as identity. Within both of these subcultures at opposite ends of the spectrum, we found that steroids do seem to become part of one's identity. So within lag culture, it's a form of machismo to be able to handle a high dose of drugs. They'll brag about the drugs they do and how much they're able to handle. I want to be as big as Ryan. Take this, then you'll be as big as him. Till then, you're just going to be a little weed. And these lads, they got no issue putting stuff in their body. So very much tied to machismo. I can handle using these drugs. And for powerlifters, it's a different way of identifying themselves with the drugs, but it's still very conscious. So we have Rich here, who is a powerlifter, who says he's experienced roid rage. Most powerlifters say it doesn't exist, and he says, maybe that's because they see people talk about roid rage as a personal attack on their sport. You're saying the drugs are dangerous, therefore you're saying powerlifting is dangerous. And that really clearly shows the identification. So that's really all I wanted to say on this topic. Thank you for listening. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So I'll start with the position of women. It's an interesting one because women, obviously with this masculine spectrum, women in the subcultures don't line up perfectly with the men. So for example, I would say the women most inclined to behave in the most hedonic manner and the most obsessive of posting on social media seem to be CrossFit women. Whereas for men, it's not so much the CrossFitters. They seem to be about in the middle of this spectrum. So I feel as though women almost, you would need to address them separately. But there is certainly an element to women posting on social media, and in some subcultures that is just exaggerated versions of femininity. It's, oh, I have, the classic physique and wanting to show that off, and in others it is very much embodying a more masculine type. So if you were to just type CrossFit girls into Google, you would get some very overly muscular women who are very clearly using steroids, and that's in that subculture that's seen as an ideal. So I think women would need separate research addressing them, but you can see some of the same themes coming out, and certainly I would say as far as social media goes, everything I've said on social media affecting men would definitely hold up for women as well. So in terms of gyms encouraging behaviors, one of the key things, it's slightly off topic for what you asked, but one of the things I've noticed is if you go in a gym and they have personal trainers who are based in the gym, and you'll see all their pictures, and I can walk in and go, 80% of those guys are on steroids. So very clearly for the gym, it's part of their business plan is they're selling this false representation to clients of, well, join our gym and you can look like this, when realistically you can't without using the steroids, but they don't tell you that up front. So I would say gyms do encourage some of these harmful behaviors, and certainly from a social policy perspective, that would be something that would need to be considered. Yeah. Yeah, so I wouldn't exclude doing digital ethnography myself. Part of what I included, so I reference Glaser and Strauss and the discovery of grounded theory in the same way as they say you can treat archives of information as being primary data. I was doing this with Facebook and Instagram as well, and some of my data that's included in the thesis is drawn from online media. So one amusing example is I was trying to interview a personal trainer about his steroid use, and I asked him, would you be happy to talk to me? And he said, I don't know about steroids, mate, I know nothing about that. But we have mutual friends on Facebook, and he was posting on a mutual friend's wall about all the steroids he was doing. So I thought that was very funny. So I anonymized it, but I had to include that anecdote because it was actually relevant to the data. So certainly I was amalgamating things that I found online with the actual data in the gym. In terms of my methodology, so it started out, I was actually training in a powerlifting gym because I had a friend who was a competitive powerlifter, and he said, oh, come along, you might find it fun. And I was doing this for a couple of years before I even thought of doing it as a PhD. So I had already got to know some powerlifters and got to hear about some of the drug use and so on before I started doing this project. And I thought, well, I could expand it into more commercial type gyms and engage in a bit of comparative analysis and see what I can draw out. But if you're in CrossFit gyms and engaged in that, I would definitely be interested in hearing about that. Yeah. So. Bit of both, to be honest. Social supply is massive. I only spoke to 2 commercial suppliers, people who sell in gyms to a wide number of people, but pretty well everyone I spoke to who used steroids was a social supplier because they would supply friends, friends would supply them. There was a lot of it similar to cannabis, wherein one guy has access and supplies his friend, and then when it switches and the other guy has access, then he'll supply back. So that's a large portion of it. But there certainly is a lot of online supply as well. And I spoke to some people who I termed it dual sourcing, wherein they'll go with whatever's more convenient. If they can access high quality product locally, they'll do that. If they can't, they'll go online. There's some good research regarding online drug use and acquisition. I'm trying to think of names off the top of my head I could give you, but Evans Brown did a piece on public health policy where they specifically looked at online forums, and that does seem to be an emerging phenomenon. Yeah, so because I started off training with powerlifters, I would say, predisposed towards the powerlifting ideal. That was what I thought of as that's the correct way, and the way that culture are doing it, that's the wrong way. So that sort of comes through my research in that although I can show powerlifters are more cautious in their drug use, they're more smart about making sure they're not taking too much, making sure they understand the drugs before they use them. But at the same time, I was perhaps a little too biased in that direction. So when I had a friend of mine confess to me at one point, quite late on in the fieldwork portion, he was a powerlifter who we'd already done our full interview and everything, and he had not let on that he had hurt himself. And then 3 months later, I think it must have been, we're just talking in the gym, and he sort of lets on that, oh no, actually, I did this stupid thing when I really harmed myself. And because I had been in with the powerlifters before, and I had this preconceived notion, that really took me by surprise. And then I had to look back at my data and say, oh, have I been accidentally... Obviously, every researcher is going to have biases, and it's more about acknowledging them as opposed to trying to remove them. But it made me more aware that I had perhaps been more biased than even I had thought. So on that portion of the question, yeah, certainly there were challenges. Regarding the first part, I think, are you familiar with Eric Anderson's work? Yeah, so inclusive masculinities is really what I draw on as far as that portion goes. I'd be very interested in reading the article you recommended. But as Anderson notes, this kind of shift in masculinities, wherein particularly in fraternities, I think was the most significant one, the way that that's changed, and now they are engaging in activities that certainly a more orthodox conception of masculinity would frown upon. So yeah, very, very interesting points. Yeah, I just adopted that because that's the term Eric Anderson was using for the more classic idea of masculinity, wherein, as we said, body hair is something a man should have, and where a man shouldn't worry about his body fat. So I was adopting it using Anderson's terminology, but I'm willing to accept that could be a loaded term, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks very much.